Okay, still with me. Good. Moving into part two of our presentation here, what I want to talk about are these three main aspects of an economic system. So we're going to describe what we mean by a mode of livelihood, by a mode of consumption, and by a mode of exchange, and clarify some of that terminology that you saw on the chart, okay, under each one of those categories. So here we go. Go get yourself a little refreshment, and I'll see you back here in a minute. Okay, still with me. Good. Moving into part two of our presentation here, what I want to talk about are these three main aspects of an economic system. So we're going to describe what we mean by a mode of livelihood, by a mode of consumption, and by a mode of exchange, and clarify some of that terminology that you saw on the chart, okay, under each one of those categories. So here we go. Go get yourself a little refreshment, and I'll see you back here in a minute. So the first dimension of an economic system that we're going to deal with is the mode of livelihood, which is also called a subsistence pattern. So the basic definition of a mode of livelihood is that it is the dominant pattern of making a living. If we look at history, we see that there are various examples of modes of livelihood. We could talk about, for example, foraging society, which we also call hunting and gathering society, horticulture, pastoralism, agriculture, and industry. If we consider horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture, that these are the three that developed after the domestication revolution. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by domestication in a minute or two. And then we have industry. We live in an industrial society, but we could also talk about other modes of livelihood. Maybe you've heard words like post-industrial society or biotechnical society or informatic society or anything like that. Those all refer to various modes of livelihood, different modes of economic life. But in our discussion, we're going to emphasize pre-industrial or non-industrial modes of livelihood, like foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture. But we will need to say something about the globalization of capitalism and what that means. So when we look at a mode of production, we are interested in how do people produce things. Hunting and gathering society, well, foraging society, they hunt and gather. They live directly off the land. Horticulture is a system that relies on, I would call it, very low intense, a very low level of intensity of farming, very labor intensive farming, basically farming with hand tools. That's what I'm struggling for. Basically farming with hand tools. Pastoralism, involving the domestication of animals, living off a herd and living off of the products of a herd. Agriculture involves farming with a plow. That would mean you have a plow and you're able to pull that plow using a non-human source of traction. And I think this might be a good place to define what we mean by domestication. So one definition of domestication that we could give is that it is the intentional planting and cultivation of selected plants, intentional cultivation, intentional hybridization of these plants, basically changing them and forcing the plants to adapt themselves to human needs. The same goes for animals, right? The breeding of animals in such a way that we are forcing the animal to adapt or adapting the animal to human needs. So domestication is the intentional planting and cultivation of selected plants and the taming and breeding of certain species of animals. And that the main benefit of domestication is that it increases the supply of these species, and therefore means that through domestication, human beings can take a more or less a proactive approach to production, especially food production. They don't have to rely so much on fate, right, or the luck of the draw. They aren't as subservient, if we could use that term. They aren't as subservient to nature. So, how do people produce? They forage, they farm, use horticulture, pastoralism, or agriculture. What kind of strategies do they use? Well, if we look on the chart, if you look on your chart, we see that they have we have words that describe two basic kinds of strategies. One is called an extensive strategy, and the other is called an intensive strategy. Hunter-gatherers use a very extensive strategy, so it involves very small numbers of people, low levels of population density. And these people live on very, very large tracts of land, very, very large areas of land. And they are constantly on the move. So they would be following, for example, game and different kinds of plants by season. And they would be constantly on the move. So they come into an area, they live there for a while, and maybe the food eventually runs its course, its season ends, and they get up and they go somewhere else. Intensive strategies are much more intense, right? It's intensive the same way that Marvin Harris talked about intensification, the need to capture vast amounts of energy using technology, right? Vast amounts of energy from nature. And so this usually means that people are going to be settled, populations are going to be very large, populations are going to be dense, and they are applying technology to production that increases the rate at which they can capture energy from nature. All right. So what else? What is the division of labor like? Well, we have two words that describe divisions of labor. The divisions of labor can be specialized or they can be unspecialized. Hunting and gathering society has a very unspecialized, a very simple division of labor. We live in a society where the division of labor is highly specialized. We have highly specialized system of occupations, and even within those occupations there is a technical division of labor. Just think about the medical field, for example. For all you nurses out there, think of how many different kinds of nursing are there. You could be a surgical nurse, or you could be a prenatal care nurse, or the list goes on and on. So we have a highly, highly specialized division of labor. Hunting and gathering societies, as we will see, right, have a very unspecialized division of labor. So there isn't, a whole lot of distinction made between the kinds of work that people do. Generally speaking, these societies are going to have a division of labor, for example, based on gender, right? Men's work and women's work. But even there, we're going to see, from examples I'm going to show you, we're going to see that sometimes there's a lot of leeway, right? There's a lot of blurriness between and a lot of crossover between these different aspects of work. So even though some work it might be defined as, like gathering, for example, maybe in Kung society thought more of as a woman's type of work, that there's no hard and fast rules about that. So men will also participate in gathering. And like I said, I'll have examples of that for you a little bit later on. So what's the division of labor like? And if you look at the chart, we see that as we move from left to right, that we move increasingly toward specialization of the division of labor. So that by the time we get to agriculture, we make that crossover point to a surplus producing society. Surplus production means that we can store a surplus, and so that not everybody has to be engaged in food production. So, some people can live on the surplus that the farmers make. And since they can live on the surplus that the farmers make, that means that they're free to do other things. So, surplus production, full blown surplus production, when we get to the agricultural revolution, gives us full blown systems of specialized occupations. I don't have to be a farmer, right? I could be an iron worker. I could be a soldier. I could be a bureaucrat, right? I could be a priest. So we have all these different occupations that develop. How do people understand property? That's another very important one. What kind of property relations do they have? So we use the terms use rights versus exclusionary rights. Foraging societies, horticultural societies are much more organized around this concept of use rights. The idea that owning something does not exclude another person from having access to it, right? Even though I own something, that doesn't mean that others don't have a right to its use. And hunting and gathering, like I said, hunting and gathering societies and horticultural societies and even pastoral societies, as we will see, have a very, very important aspect of them is their understanding of property as use rights, right? Because I have something, because I possess something, doesn't exclude you from its use. On the other hand, we live in a society where property is understood from the point of view of exclusionary rights. And what that means is that if I own something, we have a system of private property, right? So if I own something, that means that I get to exclude you from its use. That's what we mean by exclusionary rights. And so as we move from left to right and we move into agriculture and into industry, we get the development of societies where property is conceptualized along the lines of exclusionary rights. Then, Barbara Miller wants to also talk about ecological impact. I think that's an important question. What is the ecological impact of each mode of production or each mode of livelihood? Well, again, as we move from left to right, we're going to move from sustainable systems to systems that are unsustainable, right? Or systems where sustainability is at least a problem. A sustainable system means that while people have an impact on nature, they always will and they always do. They'll have an impact on nature, but it's not a heavy impact. And if you think about a hunting and gathering society, they're taking only what they need, only what they need at a time. So they're capturing very low levels of energy from nature, and means that, and they're also constantly on the move. So when they live in an area for a while and then eventually they have to pick up and leave, that area will be able to recover. So it's more or less a sustainable system as long as populations don't get too big, as long as people aren't putting too much pressure on the ecology, it can recover. sustainability becomes more of an issue as we move into agriculture and as we move into industry, because we're capturing larger and larger levels of energy, and we're capturing this energy at a much higher rate, and so we're using resources up at a rate at which the question of recoverability becomes an issue. We could, for example, in an agricultural society, we see that, for example, we could overwork land, right? And that might lead to the destruction of the viability of that land. So if we're intensely farming that land, it could lead to its turning into desert. Or irrigation, right? Irrigation systems can also lead to pressure on water supplies and contamination of water supplies and so on. So again, sustainability versus unsustainability. And now we can talk about a mode of consumption. So a way that we would understand the mode of consumption, the way we would define it is simply the dominant pattern of using things up, right? Or the dominant pattern of spending resources to meet needs. If you go back to your chart, we have two words that we use to describe these modes of consumption. We have a minimalist mode and we have a consumerist mode. A minimalist mode of consumption simply means that people are using things up at the bare minimum, pretty much only what they need to survive. So I'm going to read to you from Miller here, where she talks about the difference between minimalism and consumerism. And she says, minimalism is a mode of consumption characterized by few and finite demands and an adequate and sustainable means to achieve them. It is most characteristic of free-ranging foragers, but is also found to some degree among horticulturalists and pastoralists. And then we live in a consumer society. We live in a consumerist society. And she defines consumerist like this. She says, it's a mode of consumption in which people's demands are many and infinite. Think about that. Almost a seemingly infinite amount of consumer demand. And the means of satisfying these needs are insufficient and become depleted in the effort to satisfy these demands. So there's our difference between minimalism and consumerism. And then finally, we get into the mode of exchange. So a mode of exchange is